The first grave took him 2 hours. The ground outside Stillwater was hard in October. The summer had baked the Kansas prairie into something closer to clay than soil, and Reverend Elijah Thorne had to swing the pickaxe 11 times before the earth cracked open enough to push a shovel in. He dug alone because there was no one else to dig. The town had 43 people, and most of them were afraid to be seen at the cemetery, and the ones who weren't afraid were too old to lift a shovel. Samuel Hadley was the first, a homesteader who had filed a claim on a quarter section of grassland along the Smoky Hill River. Good land, water access, the kind of claim a man builds a life on. He had been found at the edge of his property with his neck broken and his horse standing nearby, and the sheriff had written it down as a riding accident because the sheriff worked for Dalton Marsh, and Dalton Marsh owned every acre that touched the river, except for the quarter sections the homesteaders had filed on. Elijah lowered the coffin into the ground with ropes and a prayer in a congregation of one. Ruth Hadley stood at the edge of the grave in a gray dress with a black ribbon pinned at her collar and did not cry. She had spent all her crying the night before, alone in the house Samuel had built with lumber he hauled from Abilene, and now she was empty and dry and standing in the Kansas wind like a fence post that has forgotten why it was put there. "The Lord is my shepherd," Elijah said, and the words tasted like dust. The second grave came on Tuesday. Thomas Yates, another homesteader, found in his barn with a beam across his chest. The beam had been sawed halfway through before it fell. The sheriff called it rotten timber. Elijah called it what it was when he stood over the grave, though he didn't use the word murder because he didn't have proof, and a preacher without proof is just a man shouting at the sky. The third and fourth came on Wednesday. Brothers, Patrick and Connell Dunn, Irish immigrants who had been working their claim for 2 years and had just finished building a stone wall around their property. They were found in the river, drowned, tangled in each other's arms. The sheriff said they had been drinking. The saloon keeper said they hadn't been in his establishment in a month. Nobody asked the saloon keeper to testify because nobody was holding a trial. Elijah buried them side by side. He dug both graves himself. 4 hours in the hard ground, his hands blistering through his gloves, his black coat thrown over a headstone while he worked in his shirt sleeves. Ruth Hadley came to watch. She brought water in a clay jug and set it on her husband's grave marker and sat in the dead grass and watched the preacher dig. "Why are you doing this alone?" she asked. "Because someone has to." That's not an answer. Elijah stopped digging and leaned on the shovel. His shirt was dark with sweat, and his hands were bleeding through the gloves. He looked at Ruth Hadley and saw a woman who had lost everything and was trying to understand why the man who had spoken at her husband's grave was now digging 2 more, as if this were his only purpose on earth. "I came to Stillwater 3 years ago because I believed God wanted me here," he said. "I have married 4 couples, baptized 6 children, and buried 19 people. The burying is winning." He picked up the shovel again. "When the burying is all that's left, you do it right." The 5th grave came on Thursday. Old Hector Reeves, a widower who had been farming his 60 acres since before the war. He was found in his cabin with the door open and the stove cold and a look on his face that Dr. Pruitt called heart failure. But Hector Reeves had been the healthiest 70-year-old in the county, and heart failure doesn't usually leave bruises on a man's throat, and Dr. Pruitt's hands shook when he signed the certificate because he knew what he was writing and he knew what the truth was, and the distance between those two things was killing him slowly. Elijah buried Hector Reeves on a Thursday afternoon, with storm clouds building in the west and the wind picking up off the plains carrying the smell of dust and rain. 5 graves in 4 days. 5 homesteaders whose claims all bordered Dalton Marsh's ranch. 5 deaths that the sheriff had filed as accidents and the doctor had certified as natural, and the town had accepted, because accepting was safer than asking. That night Elijah sat in his church alone. It was a small building, white clapboard with a steeple that leaned slightly east, and the pews could hold 50 people, but he hadn't seen more than 20 in them since the dying started. He sat in the front pew and looked at the cross on the wall and asked God a question he had been avoiding for 3 years. What is the point of a shepherd who watches the wolves eat the flock and does nothing but bury the bones? He didn't get an answer. He never did. But he got something else, a feeling in his chest like a rope being pulled tight, and he recognized it because he had felt it once before, years ago in Missouri, when he had watched a man beat a horse to death in the street and had done nothing, and the feeling had stayed in his chest for months until he decided to become a preacher because preaching was the opposite of silence. He looked at his hands in the candlelight. They were a mess, blisters on top of blisters, the skin torn in places where the shovel handle had worn through the gloves, dried blood in the creases of his knuckles. These were not the hands he had brought to Stillwater 3 years ago. Those hands had been soft from seminary, from turning pages instead of turning earth. Those hands had held hymnals and communion cups and the small leather Bible his mother had given him the day he was ordained. Now they held shovels. Now they held pickaxes. Now they held the weight of men he had lowered into the ground, with nothing but rope and prayer and the growing certainty that prayer alone was not going to stop the killing. He thought about the men he had buried. Samuel Hadley, who had planted an apple orchard that would never bear fruit. Thomas Yates, who had been teaching himself to read from a dictionary he ordered from St. Louis. The Dunn brothers, who had walked from New York to Kansas because someone had told them the land was free and they had believed it. Old Hector Reeves, who had survived the war and cholera and a plains winter that killed half the cattle in the county, only to die with bruises on his throat in his own cabin. 5 men, 5 homesteads, 5 claims that now had no one to defend them, which meant 5 parcels of land that would revert to open range, which meant 5 more pieces of Dalton Marsh's empire falling into place like stones in a wall. The 6th grave came on Friday. James Coulter, a young man of 23 who had been the most vocal critic of Dalton Marsh in the town. He had stood up at a town meeting 2 weeks earlier and said what everyone was thinking, that Marsh was buying the land by killing the owners. And the meeting had gone quiet the way a room goes quiet when someone says the thing that cannot be unsaid. James Coulter was found on the trail outside town, with his horse gone and his skull broken, and the sheriff said he had been thrown from the saddle, and nobody believed it, and nobody said so. Elijah buried James Coulter on a Friday morning, with the sun just coming up over the plains, and the grass wet with dew, and the cemetery growing like a small town of its own. 6 graves in 5 days. His hands were raw. His back ached in a way that went deeper than muscle. He stood over the fresh dirt and said the words and meant them, and also understood that the words were not enough. Words had never been enough. That was the lie he had been telling himself for 3 years. That speaking was the same as acting. That praying was the same as doing. That burying the dead with dignity was somehow an answer to the question of why they were dead in the first place. Ruth Hadley came to every funeral. She was the only one who came to all of them. She stood at the edge of each grave with her hands folded and her face still, and her eyes watching the preacher the way you watch a man walking toward the edge of a cliff, knowing he is going to jump and knowing you cannot stop him, and also knowing that watching is its own kind of courage. The 7th grave came on Saturday. Dr. Amos Pruitt, the doctor who had signed 7 death certificates with lies on them. He was found in his office with a bottle of laudanum empty on the desk and a note that said only, "I am sorry." The sheriff called it what it was, because suicide was not threatening to Dalton Marsh, and the truth of one death could be used to cover the lies of the others. See, the sheriff told the town. The doctor was troubled, unstable. Who knows what he was writing on those certificates? A man who would take his own life might write anything. Elijah buried Dr. Pruitt on a Saturday afternoon in the rain. The storm that had been building all week had finally broken, and the water came down in sheets that turned the cemetery to mud and filled the open grave with brown water that Elijah had to bail with a bucket before he could lower the coffin. He worked alone in the rain with his black coat plastered to his body and his boots sinking in the mud and the pickaxe slipping in his bleeding hands, and he did not stop because stopping was the one thing he could not do anymore. 7 graves, 1 week. And now the cemetery was full of men who had done nothing wrong except own land that a rich man wanted, and the town was full of people who had done nothing wrong except be afraid. And Elijah Thorne was standing in the rain in a graveyard with mud on his knees and blood on his hands and the absolute certainty that he would be next. He went back to the church that night. He lit a candle and sat at his desk and wrote a letter. He wrote down every name, every date, every lie on every death certificate. He wrote down what he had seen and what he had heard and what the town knew but would not say. He wrote about Dalton Marsh and the water rights and the homestead claims and the pattern that was as clear as a cattle brand on white hide. 7 men dead in 7 days, all of them homesteaders, all of them bordering Marsh's land, all of them filed as accidents or natural causes by men who worked for Marsh or were afraid of him. He sealed the letter and addressed it to the federal marshal's office in Topeka. He walked through the rain to Ruth Hadley's homestead, the house Samuel had built, where a lamp still burned in the window because Ruth had not yet learned to stop leaving it on for a man who was not coming home. She opened the door before he knocked. She had seen him coming across the field, a dark shape in the rain, and she had known it was him because no one else in Stillwater walked with that particular combination of purpose and exhaustion. He gave her the letter. He told her what was in it. He told her to mail it if anything happened to him, and she asked what he meant by anything, and he said she would know. She took the letter without a word. She held it against her chest the way she had held Samuel's shirt the night after the funeral, pressing it close as if the paper itself contained something living. Then she looked at the preacher standing in her doorway with rain running down his face and mud on his boots and the expression of a man who has finally decided to stop being careful. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Something I should have done on Monday." She nodded. She put the letter inside a tin box on the kitchen shelf, next to Samuel's pocket watch and the deed to the homestead and the dried wildflowers from their wedding day. All the things that mattered enough to keep and too painful to look at. Then she closed the door, and Elijah walked back into the rain. He picked up his shovel and walked to the cemetery. He chose a spot at the end of the row, next to Dr. Pruitt, where the ground was soft from the rain and the digging was easier than it had been all week. He dug for 3 hours in the dark. The rain stopped and the clouds broke and the stars came out and the Kansas plains stretched away in every direction, flat and silver in the moonlight, and the only sound was the shovel cutting earth and the preacher breathing and the wind moving through the grass like a congregation whispering. He dug the grave 6 feet deep. He dug it the same dimensions as the others, careful and straight, the way he had dug every grave that week. because if it was going to be his, then it was going to be done right. When he finished, he climbed out and drove a wooden cross into the dirt at the head of it and stood back and looked at what he had made. 8 graves in a row, 7 filled, 1 empty. And on the cross, he had carved 2 words with his pocket knife: the truth. On Sunday morning, Elijah Thorne rang the church bell for the first time in 3 weeks. He rang it for 10 minutes, long enough for the sound to carry across the whole town and out to the edges of Marsh's ranch, long enough for people to stop what they were doing and look toward the steeple and wonder what had changed. They came, not all of them, but more than 20, more than had come to any service since the dying started. They filed into the pews and sat in silence and looked at the preacher standing at the pulpit in his mud-stained coat with his bandaged hands and the expression on his face of a man who has made a decision that cannot be unmade. He told them everything. He named every man he had buried. He named the cause of each death, the real cause, not the one on the certificate. He named Dalton Marsh. He named the sheriff. He named the pattern and the motive and the water rights and the homestead claims, and he laid it out plain and clear, the way a man lays out a body for burial, with care and precision and the understanding that what he was doing could not be undone. "I have dug 8 graves this week," he said, 7 for the men Dalton Marsh had killed, and 1 for myself, because I would rather lie in honest ground than stand in a church where the truth is not welcome. The room was silent. The wind pressed against the windows. A child coughed somewhere in the back. And then Ruth Hadley stood up. She stood in her gray dress with the black ribbon at her collar, and she looked at the congregation, and she said, "My husband's name was Samuel. He did not fall from a horse. And I will not sit in this town one more day pretending that he did." A farmer named Gideon Bell stood next, then his wife, then the woman who ran the general store, then the blacksmith, a man named Tom Yeager, who had shod Marsh's horses for years and had seen the riders come and go on the nights the homesteaders died. One by one they stood, and each one who stood made it easier for the next one, because courage is like a fire that way. It only needs 1 match. By noon, 12 people had signed statements in Elijah's church. By evening, Ruth Hadley had mailed 2 letters to Topeka, the one Elijah had given her, and a new one with 12 signatures. By the following Wednesday, 2 federal marshals rode into Stillwater on horses lathered with sweat from a hard ride, and asked to see the cemetery. Elijah walked them through the graves. He showed them each cross, each name, each date. He showed them the 8th grave, the empty one, with the cross that said the truth. He told them what he had told the congregation, and the marshals listened the way men listen when they have been waiting for someone to say what needed to be said. Dalton Marsh was arrested on his ranch on a Thursday morning in late October, exactly 1 week after the last funeral. He was standing on his porch when the marshals rode up, and he looked at them the way a man looks at rain on a day he planned to ride, as an inconvenience rather than a reckoning. He did not believe it was happening until they put the irons on his wrists, and even then, his face held the expression of a man who expected this to be temporary, because men like Dalton Marsh do not believe that consequences apply to them until the cell door closes and does not open again. His foreman and 3 of his men were arrested with him. The sheriff resigned before they came for him and was found 2 days later halfway to Colorado, riding a horse he had taken from the livery without paying, which was the kind of small dishonesty that suited a man whose entire career had been built on larger ones. The homestead claims were restored to the families of the dead men, and the water rights were divided among the remaining settlers, and the town of Stillwater began the slow and painful work of becoming a place where people could live without being afraid. Elijah Thorne filled in the 8th grave on a Sunday afternoon in November. Ruth Hadley helped him. They worked together in silence, shoveling the dirt back into the hole he had dug for himself. And when it was level with the ground, Ruth looked at the wooden cross that still said, "The Truth," and asked if he wanted to pull it out. "Leave it," he said. "It's an empty grave." "It's not empty. It's full of every word I should have said sooner." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. The wind was blowing her long brown hair across her face, and she pushed it back with a hand that was calloused from work she hadn't done before her husband died. She had been running the homestead alone for 2 weeks now, cutting wood and hauling water and mending fences, and she was thinner than she had been at Samuel's funeral, but she was also steadier, the way a person gets when grief turns into something they can use. "You said sooner," she said. "That means you think you were late." "I was late. 7 men are dead because I thought praying was enough. 7 men are dead because Dalton Marsh killed them. You're the reason it stopped at 7. Elijah looked at the row of graves. 8 crosses in the Kansas grass, 7 over bodies and 1 over truth, and the wind moving through all of them equally, because the wind doesn't know the difference between the dead and the living. It only knows that everything bends. He took off his gloves and looked at his hands. They were healing. The blisters had hardened into calluses and the cuts had closed, and the skin was toughening the way skin does when you use your hands for something that matters. They didn't look like a preacher's hands anymore. They looked like a gravedigger's hands. And maybe that was the same thing. Maybe it had always been the same thing. The church bell caught the afternoon light and held it the way it always did, and the Smoky Hill River ran south through the valley carrying leaves and cold water and the slow, steady knowledge that seasons change. And in a small cemetery on the Kansas plains, an empty grave with a wooden cross stood at the end of a row, like a period, at the end of a sentence that the whole town had finally learned to read. It was not a grave. It was a sermon, the only one that mattered.